Bonjour, my name is Lana Ray, Lana Ray Indigenous Ajal Kanoje Nadodam, Weskane Gijagok, Anishinaabe No Swin. So I just wanted to start with a traditional introduction, also Pognisinen Nadonji, as well as a traditional acknowledgement. So Miigwech, Gachi Goengen, Miigwech, Nagani Gachi Game. So just wanted to start by acknowledging the lands, so this place that we're on, Toronto, as well as the waters that we're on here as well. So part of my talk today, it's kind of taking me a little bit back in time. It's kind of based off and building upon some work that I actually did in 2012 when I was still a PhD student and was really starting to think about what my own research would look like and really starting to grapple with some of the tensions of different research methods, paradigms that I was being exposed to. So during that time, especially after Linda Smith's decolonizing methodology, right, we kind of saw this boom in terms of Indigenous scholarship. And so there continues to be, which is amazing and great, a lot of new information and scholarship available. So I was really trying to make sense of how does that all fit and what makes sense for me in terms of the work that I'm going to do. So maybe we'll switch slides. Yeah, so the title is just kind of a play off the title of the article, which was kind of looking at deciphering the Indigenous and Indigenous methodologies. So in this case, we're kind of deciphering what does that TRC, so kind of a nod to what does that focus on decolonizing research, Indigenous research, mean within the context or the relationship with emancipatory paradigms. So, can you go back? Yep. Back a slide? Yeah, so I just wanted to start with this. This is actually a mural that I found. It's painted actually on a pharmacy somewhere in downtown Toronto. And I thought it was beautiful in terms of the title. So to acknowledge the artist or the main artist, Philip Cote. And so the title of this piece is First Peoples Leading the Eighth Fire. So what that's really speaking about for Anishinaabe people, we have a prophecy that talks about lighting the eighth fire, and talks about the responsibility and the choice and the role for Anishinaabe people as well as settler people in terms of being able to come to that place of the eighth fire. So when I'm talking about the relationship between Indigenous methodologies and ways of knowing and critical methodologies, I'm really trying to approach it from that place of not being, I guess, critical of the critical, but instead really coming from a good place of seeing how can these knowledge systems work together within this broader framework of trying to light the eighth fire. I also really liked this picture because when I did my traditional introduction, so I'm a member of the Fish Clan. And so one of my responsibilities as a member of the Fish Clan is to actually be a mediator as well as to be a teacher. So in the work that I do, the academic work that I do, any kind of work that I do, I always try to frame it in terms of my own responsibilities, and one of those being my clan responsibility. So that really spoke to me. And then I also liked how there's a moose in the picture because when I was thinking about how I wanted to do this talk, and Chan can attest to this, I was kind of skirting sending an abstract for a little while. So how I usually work is I always start with a story. And so for me, part of still the legacy of colonialism is I'm a language learner, so I'm not a language speaker. So you'll see I'll attempt to use some language words. Sometimes I might stumble, but I always try to use them. So I try to think about what are other ways that I could do the work that I do within Anishinaabe worldview understanding. And so for me, stories has really been one of those ways that I connect and do that work. So usually when I start something, I just spend some time and I just think about stories. And usually, sometimes it takes longer than others, but then there's kind of a story that pops in my head, and at that point, everything kind of becomes clear. I kind of have my path for what I'm going to talk about. So that's really how I work and what guides my work. And also, if we're talking about Anishinaabe language, Anishinaabemowin, does anyone know how to say moose in Anishinaabe?
Moose.
Yeah, I was going to say, everyone can learn a Anishinaabe word today. So it's moose, M-O-O-Z. So I'm just going to start with a story. And so this is a story about Wanabojo and the moose skull. So I think stories are also important, as I've kind of alluded to, in terms of a theoretical framework, in terms of a methodological framework for the research that we do. But also I think stories are connected to that idea of resurgence and resistance. So by talking about the story of Wanabojo, which happened, we don't necessarily place a certain year on it, but happened a while ago with moose that are in this territory. So having this story is an assertion of our sovereignty, right? That we know kind of what's been happening and those relationships with the land. So that piece is important too. And so for Anishinaabe people, we have a lot of stories about Wanabojo. And so you'll hear the explanation of who is Wanabojo different ways. So Wanabojo is a spirit. So I might say Wanabojo or he or she, but I'll mix it up so there's not that same gendered idea. And so Wanabojo teaches us, is I guess a cultural hero, and teaches us a lot about how we should live and behave respectfully on this earth, on Turtle Island. But Wanabojo does that in a bit of a different way. So Wanabojo isn't always perfect, where then we're striving to achieve the same actions or stature as Wanabojo. But instead, Wanabojo often has really good intent, but that doesn't necessarily always follow through with good actions or good results. So we also learn a lot from Wanabojo's mistakes as well. So that may be different from other ideologies, for example, where there's maybe a spiritual figure that's kind of the height of this is what we're trying to achieve in our own life. So just wanted to provide a bit of context before I tell the story. So like I said, this is the story of Wanabojo and the moose skull. So Wanabojo one day was just walking through the bush and was walking and walking, and next thing you know, Wanabojo stubbed his toe. And so when he looked down, or she looked down and saw what he had stubbed his toe on, it was a moose skull. And when Wanabojo looked closer at that moose skull, Wanabojo noticed that, and if anyone's kind of seen a moose skull, the nose is kind of long, that there was some meat that was inside that nose of that moose skull. So Wanabojo was hungry and was really excited and wanted to eat that meat. So she decided, usually maybe the best way to do this would be to actually break that moose skull and then get that meat out. But I'm really hungry. So Wanabojo decided that he was going to turn into a snake so he could slither in and get that moose meat. So Wanabojo concentrated, turned into that snake, and as he was in that moose skull, was so close to that meat, he was so excited that he lost focus and he turned back into his other form. And when that happened, Wanabojo's head got stuck in that moose skull. And so Wanabojo started kind of flailing around and bumping into things, and so kept walking. And eventually Wanabojo bumped into a tree. And he had this idea too that, maybe to get this moose skull off, I should try to go down to the river and I'll put some water, it'll loosen it up, and then I could eat that moose meat. So keeps walking and bumps into a tree. And so when he bumps into the tree, he says, Bonjour, Anish Ejnakazian. Hi, what's your name? And so the first tree says, Anatig Nadijnakaz. So my name is Maple. And so Wenebojo then asks, I know maples always live near the water. Where's the water? You must be very close to the water. And the maple tree said, no, I'm not too close. So then Wenebojo kept walking. And so this happened a couple more times. And then Wenebojo bumped into another tree and said, Bojo, Anish Ejnakazian. Hello, what's your name? And the tree said, Gijik Nadijnakaz. My name is Cedar. So then the Wenebojo proceeded and asked, I know about cedar trees. Cedar trees grow really close to the water. Can you tell me where the water is? Is it close? And the tree said, yes, it's close. And then he said, okay, just point me in the direction. And so the tree did. So as Wenebojo's walking in the direction, all of a sudden he walks off this giant cliff. So the river was close, but it was down at the bottom of this cliff. And so when he lands, what happens is that skull ends up breaking, but it bounces off a rock, it goes in the river, and the skull with the meat goes downstream. And Wenebojo doesn't get that meal, doesn't get that moose meat. So that's the story of Wenebojo and the moose, and the moose head. So I guess the other part about stories, and Indigenous scholar Joanne Archibald has written extensively on this, the idea of Indigenous story work. So how stories really, again, play that role in terms of our theoretical, methodological frameworks, but they do so in a way where they're not direct. So it's not saying, thou shalt do this way. And stories also can meet people where they are. So, and they may sometimes take some time to work. So just to give that context, so we'll leave that for now, and then give people time for that story to kind of work on you, and then we'll return to it at the end of the talk. So just to start, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to kind of give a brief overview of the history of Indigenous research. So I really like this framework or timeline. This is by Cree scholar Sean Wilson. So he talks about a couple of different phases of research. So the first one, Terra Nullius. So this is really about research being conducted in terms of mapping, or really to show that this land hasn't been used, or at least hasn't been used properly, as would be deemed by Western society. So really this research is setting the basis for settler colonialism, right? So this land is vacant, nothing quote unquote productive is happening here. So it's okay for us to come settle here, use the resources as we wish. And then so the next stage is really about that traditionalizing, and that's talking about that kind of continued effort that we still see today, right, actually, to some extent. So maybe that's a point I should make. This is kind of put as a historical timeline, but some of this will still be familiar today with some research that's done. But this is really talking about dehumanizing Indigenous peoples, right? So we see that in terms of different eugenics research or other research. We see that today in terms of journalism and the way that Indigenous people still continue to be dehumanized, right, in a lot of stories that are there. So again, we see this continuation. First, okay, this land's available. Now research is being used to say, look, these people clearly need our guidance. They're not capable of having their own governance structures, culture, etc. So that sets the stage for that well, cultural genocide, but just genocide overall and settler colonialism. And then Sean Wilson talks about going into the next stage, so that assimilation stage of research. And so you see different iterations of that, but basically now it's okay where we don't really seem to be going anywhere, at least physically. So how can we, I guess, mitigate what's quote unquote called the Indian problem, right? So this is that next stage. And so one example might be research done around relocation programs, for example, to try to assimilate Indigenous peoples into cities. And then the next stage is research on Indigenous peoples. So I think this still has some flavor of the prior ones, but still that very kind of typical relationship of like the researcher, the researchee. And so we see a lot of misrepresentations and misunderstandings arising about Indigenous peoples because of this kind of research. And we also don't see a lot of benefits to Indigenous peoples because of this kind of research. And so you can kind of see by this history why now there's been a flurry or quite a huge growth in terms of Indigenous methodologies, right? Part of that resurgence, that reclaiming, saying we're going to define and talk about ourselves, and we're going to make decisions and lead plans of action in terms of what we're going to do as families, communities, and nations. And then you also see how, right, this sort of research has also lended itself to the emergence of critical theory and so these emancipatory paradigms of research. So, and I should mention too, so I'm talking about, the talks about critical theory, but it's really about critical theory in relation to Indigenous ways of knowing. So I don't live in this space of critical theory. So, right, to have a debate about all the the granulars of, say, like the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, I'm not the best person for that, but what I'm really talking about and what I'm basing this talk off of is I've been doing this work for about 15 years now. And so I'm bringing in a lot of my experiences of working with people who are working within critical approaches to research and some of the tensions and hiccups that we've had throughout those years. So that's what I'm talking about, that relationship and how critical theory, some ways that it may be able to learn from Indigenous approaches and ways of knowing. So I really liked this model by Musa Mitha. I'm not sure, my apologies if I didn't pronounce that name right. Just gonna bring this model up on here so I'm not looking back and forth. But I think one thing that they talk about is this idea of critical theory, thinking about it broadly and not kind of putting different approaches within a box. So they put forth this spectrum of thinking about critical theory. And so it occurs at different levels, right? The level of it being critical, but also how it kind of decentralizes this idea of what's normal or maybe heteronormative ideas of knowledge and knowledge production. So for example, I'm not talking about any particular space in here around critical theory. So I'm going to provide, say, some examples of my work in terms of Indigenous feminism, which looking at this would probably be a little bit more towards the difference-centered critical. I'll just point quickly. So that would be like kind of over here. If you're thinking about those more kind of traditional Frankfurt schools of critical theory, those would kind of be over here, right? Still kind of those heteronormative ideas of labor, yet still thinking about labor in terms of oppression. But yeah, so you kind of see this at different degrees. Some of it is looking at, okay, how can we examine and make people more fruitful within our structures? And then other forms are more so, okay, how can we actually move past these structures and think of some alternatives? But I think one of the distinctions with critical theory and Indigenous thought is critical theory still very much resides in that social construction of knowledge. And Indigenous methodology very much relies in that spiritual construction of knowledge. So even when you think of the story when I was talking about, I kind of wait till a story comes to me. So for me, that's a very spiritual process of how that story comes to me. So that's how my work is guided. And so this is from the article I mentioned of Deciphering the Indigenous and Indigenous Methodologies. So when I was trying to make sense of, okay, what do I see? What are kind of the different bodies of research that are emerging? What are the relationships? And so I found there was basically two main points. And so this is from 2012 too, so things have, just like everything, have kind of grown, expanded since then. So we're going to focus more so on the strategic Indigenous methodologies, but this really spoke to me in terms of it's basically people who are engaging with critical theory, but are doing that in Indigenous contexts. So yeah, from a theoretical perspective, largely critical theory is being used, and there's some sort of emancipatory goal related to resistance and decolonization. And then kind of where I tend to live, I think a little bit more, and I should mention for strategic, so it could include Indigenous knowledges, but that's not at the forefront. And the goal is to create space for Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and being. And then with convergence, that's more so about focusing on how can we conduct research from within an Indigenous paradigm. And so this is where you see examples like Maggie Kovach, Cree scholar, and some of her work, Sean Wilson, who talks about research as ceremony. So these are very much rooted within the spiritual relational paradigms. And what I found, though, is that within these sorts of methodologies, still often non-Indigenous methods were being used. So the broader framework and everything was from this relational paradigm, but there were still, for example, interviews or things like that being used. And so there were some tensions that Indigenous scholars were talking about in relation to trying to merge those together. So basically the main point I had made in that article, and I think still rings true today, is this idea of ensuring that we acknowledge the differences between traditional knowledge systems and Western knowledge systems so that Indigenous peoples, lands, and knowledges are not held to the same standards or constrictions as Western bodies of knowledge. So still can be very valuable where you're working, but just understanding kind of where's the limitations, or if I'm doing this or conceiving this as Indigenous methodology, what am I maybe taking space away from, for example. And so I'll give you an example of this, right? Critical theory, it's really looking at power relations. So if we think about doing work in that paradigm, and we think about Indigenous peoples, we're really then thinking about Indigenous peoples and their relationships in terms of resistance and oppression. And so if we kind of take this a little bit farther, I really like this quote by Sean Wilson. So he says, rather than viewing ourselves as being in relationship with other people or things, we are the relationships that we hold or are part of. So again, going back to that example, so we're rather always identified as resistors or as oppressed. And so within relational paradigms, we have different teachings that talk about different aspects or way to understand relationships, such as through kindness, love, bravery, for example. And so even I was thinking about what would be another example to talk about here, and kind of what popped into my mind was And we probably heard this expression quite a lot, the idea that knowledge is power, right? We've probably all heard that and had conversations about that idea that knowledge is power. And so think, how does that change if we were to say knowledge is responsibility? How might that change our relationships? How might that change our way of being? So again, going back to Sean Wilson's words, if knowledge is about power, and we as researchers get to hold a lot of knowledge, hear a lot of knowledge, how are then we thinking about our relationships? Versus thinking, knowledge is responsibility. I have a lot of knowledge, therefore I have a lot of responsibility. So again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with thinking about knowledge as power, and that's been something that's, I think, been critical to trying to deconstruct and re-envision some of the relationships, but that could only take us so far. So I think that's an example of seeing how critical theory and Indigenous knowledges, ways of knowing, being theory can work together. And so I was thinking of an example to talk about, to kind of demonstrate different ways that research can be done within a strategic Indigenous methodology. And when I was thinking about it, I thought, you know what? Actually, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission kind of fits the bill of a strategic Indigenous methodology. So the TRC, right, when we think of the overall goal, at least on the surface, is reconciliation, whatever that means. So there's clearly some relationship or some recognition of there being oppressive relationships, the need to decolonize. And then when you think about the process, the actual TRC process, right, that too, it was unearthing. So a lot of the questions were unearthing. What are the impacts of colonialism? What has been your experience with colonialism in the context of the Indian residential school? And then when you think about the process, there's lots of recommendations if we're thinking about creating space for Indigenous ways of doing and being. There's lots of recommendations, right, that talk about that. Everyone here would probably be really familiar with the need to kind of indigenize or decolonize curriculum, for example. And if you recall, when I talked about strategic Indigenous methodologies, one thing I also talked about was that they can or cannot include Indigenous methods. So this is a picture in the TRC it did of some of the commissioners for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there's, I think, like a gifting or a blanket ceremony or something that's happening there. So I just thought, I think it's quite well documented, and I'm certainly not the first to say this, but there's been a lot of criticisms, right, in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned there in terms of what researchers can do within their own practice. So next slide. And so just to that point, so right, 2020, this is what reconciliation looks like. So this is a picture from what's happening out in BC with the Wet'suwet'en people who are defending their land, which has never been ceded to the federal government, to anyone who, although they don't need the recognition from federal government or from the federal courts, the courts have said, when the hereditary chiefs put forth their case, that yes, Indigenous title does exist and did recognize the right of and responsibility of the hereditary chiefs in this area to make decisions concerning their land. So everyone, I assume, knows what's happening in terms of coastal link and pipeline development and the RCMP and paramilitary occupation of Indigenous lands in BC. So I brought this up, one, as an act of solidarity and awareness. I think kind of any conversations we're having about reconciliation, critical theory, responsibilities as people who have all the skills necessary to advocate and disseminate this information and organize, that's really important. But I also brought it up because I think it speaks to the point that I think when we deconstruct and look at the methodology used within the TRC, we could see how the outcomes intended were never really going to happen. And that's no disrespect to the commissioners who did really great work and are trying to work and do the best that they can within a system, right, that and process that was still very oppressive. Sorry, can you just go back? Yeah, so when we think about the TRC, these are, I think, some of the main criticisms or points where I think things went wrong. So first of all, if you think about how that project was framed, how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was framed, so it came out of, right, the Indian Residential School settlement agreement, where there was commemorative pieces, there was compensation to survivors, there was Aboriginal and Healing Foundation, and then there was actually the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I think right from the get-go, the fact that part of the settlement for Indian residential school survivors was used to fund a project which was really the responsibility of the Canadian government and the Canadian society to take responsibility for the state we're in, right? So the fact that it was survivors who had to fund that truth-seeking effort, when we all know, maybe not the granular details, but we all as Indigenous peoples already knew what happened and know the impacts. And so, for example, I didn't go to Indian residential school, but my grandmother did when she was 6 years old for about 7 years, right? And so I lived those, I experienced those impacts. So I think that was really important to think about how it was originally framed. And so again, this lens was really cast at looking at Indigenous suffering instead of looking at settler actions, right? And so even we know within this commission there was not really that space for accountability there as well. And the inquiry too was also recommended after the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in the 90s. So it really came as, one could argue, risk mitigation for the federal government for a settlement. So I think that's important. So then who's actually fully on board with that process and within that framing? Where's the commitment if it's coming out of the pockets really of Indian residential school survivors? And the idea is applied out of its original context. So the TRC has really become synonymous with reconciliation across the board, right? You can't really write any proposal or anything related to Indigenous without citing the TRC and connecting it to the TRC. So I think that's important to think about. So that came out of a very specific context of Indian residential schools, but it's really kind of grown to be synonymous with reconciliation as a whole. So I think when you do that, it loses some meaning and some localized context. The language of reconciliation and the way that reconciliation was conceived. So even the concepts around forgiveness. Again, these aren't my ideas. Different Indigenous scholars have talked about this. But basically that idea, right, that forgiveness is something that really cuts Indigenous peoples out of the equation. In some respects, forgiveness can be seen as someone's own religious or spiritual process. with the Creator, but also the emphasis on forgiveness kind of puts a timeline and the onus back on Indigenous peoples. And framing it in terms of how reconciliation was framed or how justice was. Again, different scholars like Green have talked about kind of this neoliberal approach to reconciliation and compensation, right? And so there was a study that was done by the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, and over about 50% of those who received a settlement said it did nothing to actually impact their health and well-being, and talked about how even it was being an individual process, and that was really problematic. And I could attest in my own family. So when my grandma passed away, she hadn't spent a cent of her Indian residential school settlement. And even the process itself, right, is the way it was controlled, the timelines, the forms. It wasn't, if anyone kind of was involved with any of that process, it definitely didn't give you, for me anyways, the feeling of being empowered in any way or being self-determining in any way. Yeah, so next slide. So just thinking, I think, about some of those lessons learned from the TRC, where if you look at the surface, right, looks like a strategic Indigenous methodology, generally following some principles of critical theory to have some sort of emancipation, positive benefits for Indigenous peoples. In the process, though, a lot went wrong, and it was really kind of doomed from the get-go. And there's been similar criticisms about other inquiries, right, including ones related to missing and murdered Indigenous women as well. So if we look at those lessons, I think there's a couple to learn and that we could apply to our own context and to our own work in health research. So one is that idea of how is the project approached and how is it resourced. So this idea of, are we researching dominance or are we researching Indigenous peoples? So I'll give you an example. There's a project I'm working on right now. My co-PI, Dr. Wiley, is in the audience, is working on that. We're working on that together. And our first stage is we're trying to understand how we could make hospital spaces, healthcare spaces less oppressive for Indigenous peoples. But the place that we're starting is we're interviewing health service providers. So we're trying to get a sense, what are their perceptions in terms of why they're doing this work? What is their responsibilities towards Indigenous peoples? When you hear about these, stories in the news, how are they making meaning of that? Are they seeing that as, problems within their own institution? Or are they framing that as part of the quote-unquote Indian problem? So we could have started, right, with talking to Indigenous peoples, and we will too, but that engagement is coming in a very different way of saying, okay, what has to be done? So we right off the hop didn't start with, tell me your most absolute horrible story of being at the hospital, right? We didn't start from a place of Indigenous suffering. And the other thing, I think, thinking about this broadly, and is really kind of difficult because of our own responsibilities or expectations as academics, but thinking about what grants are you applying to? So again, if you think of the TRC, should funds earmarked for Indigenous research in 2020, is it ethical to use those to create resources to unlearn the behavior of non-Indigenous healthcare providers? Or should that money go towards insurgence work, resurgence work for Indigenous people? So really thinking about what are those calls. So if you see a call out there that's earmarked Indigenous research, what's actually getting funded? Is it actually working to progress something for Indigenous peoples themselves? Or is it, again, focused on educating settlers and institutions? So think of that idea. Is, like with the TRC, is this money coming out of the pockets of Indigenous peoples? I would say would be a question to ask yourself. And just to give some examples, so one project that I'm working on is related to food. And so trying to do work around food resurgence. And so it started to become, though, having these conversations of we need to do cultural training for people in organizations. And that was really problematic because there was already a quote-unquote mainstream group that was very similar that had a mandate around social justice. So instead of them using their resources, their time, etc. to do that work, felt like that pillar just kind of slowly started floating over to our circle. And so there's difficult conversations that are still happening about that. But it's much, I think we start from a much better place if people could start to ask these questions instead of, I can only speak for myself, but as an Indigenous researcher, I'm often in places where I am then the person who has to have that conversation. And another example, so I got asked to work on a project around land acknowledgement. And so within that project, right away, people had started talking about, well, let's talk to people from the local First Nation. We'll get stories about the land. And these were non-Indigenous researchers. And so I asked the question, I said, why is it that non-Indigenous researchers always want to tell our stories? What if you tell your own story? What if you talk about kind of what's happened here on the land, how those forces of settler colonialism have impacted and how you're doing work to change that? How about you tell that story? And so we had that conversation, and then we had another conversation because then the next thing came, well, we'll tell these stories and we'll apply for a grant to do this work, to tell these stories, right? So again, it again became this, we're going to tell your stories and we're going to take the money out of your pockets to do it. And saying it that way, it seems so easy to see. But when you're in these processes, it's not often the case. People don't always see them. And think about, how do you situate yourself in the research? So Brittany Luby, I Anishinaabe scholar, I love the work that she does. And she talks about what happens in research if we situate our work within our treaty relationships. How might that recenter or rechange the way that we do our work? And I think that would also lend to answering some of the questions that we just discussed above about how do you approach your work. And I think it would help us get away from this helping narrative. So I was working with a non-Indigenous researcher, and so we decided to do an exercise, and he decided that he would do reflexive journaling, and then we'd read it and discuss it together. And so one thing that was apparent within it, there was a lot of talks, and he had created this theme around, like, I just kind of fell into this work. This work was really just meant to be. I was meant to be here and do this work. And it was, again, doing work where it's kind of telling Indigenous stories. And then I thought, well, maybe you could look at it at another way. So you're talking about this opportunity who came out of a lengthy conversation in a hallway with another non-Indigenous white male. So I said, you felt really comfortable having that conversation, but would everyone feel as comfortable, have the same length of conversation? So we started to kind of break down these experiences that were really positioned as kind of just meant to be moments. and we're able to see how power and privilege were really working to create a space where then someone was able to have the resources and the time to actually go into an Indigenous community and sit and listen for stories on for days. So I think that's another important piece, thinking how am I situating myself here? And Research is Resistance. If anyone hasn't read that, I think it's had a couple of editions. It's this is taken out of the 2015 edition. It's a great resource. So one thing talked about is how is our positionality and our ideology shaping our work and our decision making. So I'll give you one more example. I was at a session, it was on health research and participatory research and methodologies. And so we were given a task, we were going to hear a case study, and then we had to discuss what would we do in that situation. So I'm in this group, and our session was about Indigenous research experience. I was the only Indigenous, or at least person who made it known that they were Indigenous within my group. And so this case was shared about how there was work being done with Indigenous youth, and that there was an adult community member hired Indigenous to do this work too. And that person wasn't really doing their job. And so the question posed was it ethical for me as a non-Indigenous researcher, the PI on this project, to fire this person? Is it my space to actually interject in what's happening in community? Or is that someone in the community who should fire this individual who wasn't doing their job? And so this conversation went on, and so that was the frame, right? That was set up. And then I asked the question, I said, I'm sorry, do you mind me asking, who hired the individual to begin with? And the person said, well, the non-Indigenous PI hired the individual. And so then that changed the conversation. So I said, well, how is it ethical and okay for you to be able to make that decision when it's a good, feel-good decision, but when it's a decision that has potential implications and doesn't feel so great, that now it becomes a discourse around, is this my place as a non-Indigenous researcher? And so asking that follow-up question totally changed it. So the way that was originally framed really just provided a certain way for the conversation to unfold. I'm thinking about, how am I doing for time?
10 to 1.
Okay. And so when we're thinking about how research is framed too, and I had brought in those examples of thinking about, for example, what if we frame knowledge as power versus what if we frame knowledge as responsibility? So when thinking about health from Indigenous context, Anishinaabe context, there's definitely a spiritual aspect there, and it's a holistic way of knowing. So sometimes people ask me, what kind of research do you do? And it kind of seems like I'm all over the place, because it looks like I do a little bit of everything. But it's all just so interconnected. So when we think about knowledge, it's not just socially constructed, right? That idea that it's spiritually constructed. So what happens if we're engaging in Indigenous research projects? What limitations might there be from working outside of that paradigm? Next slide, please. And I'll just give you a couple examples of some work that I've done. And I think, again, with the example from participatory action research, the one we just had, like, it kind of lives or resides in that space that Eve talks about, right, of those moves to innocence. So again, sometimes critical research, we might be thinking about right, what's the outcome this is going to create, but what is our role within that? And thinking back to the TRC, where it was really that end goal may have been there, but that process what was lacking. So some of the work I've done, and I think one I'm hearing more often is work around Indigenous resilience in a healthcare setting. And I think there's a lot of value in that. But I think sometimes the way it's used, again, works to reframe that lens. So if we're focusing on Indigenous resilience in response to something, we're not focusing on the behaviors of the people who maybe then prompted that response of resilience, right? So I had a recent example. This is a graduate student who was doing some work with wanting to look at patient experience and their relationship with healthcare providers. And so their original question was related to how can implicit bias impact Indigenous families' resilience. And so if we actually break down that question, we see there's 2 points where they're really skirting, right, any kind of looking at the agency or responsibility of healthcare providers. So the first one, the use of the term implicit bias, right away it's, right, that idea, it's unconscious. And arguably, whether if you think about it beyond an individual level, which I think also helps facilitate a move towards innocence, we see that those biases become ingrained as a process of settler colonialism to implement and then for the continuation of settler colonialism. Excuse me. And then the second part that I talked about, and then patient resilience. So again, that's really turning the lens and focusing then on putting the onus on Indigenous families in that case. Some other work I've done, some of the work I've done with violence against Indigenous women. So I used to work at a provincial Indigenous women's organization as their director of policy and research. And so we did some work around sex trafficking. Excuse me, I'm a little out of practice after the Christmas break for lecturing. So what we found, some of the ways that people who were engaging in critical theory were really talking about that work within that lens of prostitution as self-determination, without understanding kind of what the use of self-determination means in an Indigenous context and the political context of that. And so while it's really important to acknowledge the resilience of Indigenous women, Indigenous peoples, as they're on a day-to-day basis, really just we're trying to survive settler colonialism. What happens if we frame that as self-determination, right? It really just works to normalize violence against Indigenous women and normalize the fact that our women have to do things that they shouldn't have to have basic human rights met. So again, we see there was, right, some good intentions there in terms of the work, and also some cultural teachings around openness and sexuality. From my perspective, were really misunderstood and misconstrued to inform and support some of that work as well. And then, so when we're thinking about, so it's really important, I think, and that just goes back to relationships. So what is the limitations to envision maybe alternatives or move things forward from a critical paradigm? Can we work in relation where critical paradigm has work to do to create space, but then Indigenous methodologies are there to envision Indigenous futurities moving forward? So just thinking of, again, not to say there's no value, there's a lot of value, but just kind of how are they being used and in what spaces. And then thinking about where do you conduct research. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I heard someone, a terrestrial knowledge holder from Sudbury, was talking about growing up as Anishinaabe people on the land, hunting, fishing, eating berries. What we do is we're consuming creation, and through all those generations, that's part of how we maintain that we are creation. So we have that really close tie to the land. So I've really been thinking a lot about ethics of research, and research that isn't localized, both in terms of what that means for relationship and understanding, but as well what that means for responsibility, and also what that means financially. So do I need to pay for a plane ticket to do research somewhere? Is there someone there who can do that research? So for example, the project with Dr. Wiley, it started from work that she was already doing, and there was a request, can we continue and bring this work to a Thunder Bay site? So that's kind of how I came in. It was like, well, we should have someone local then at that site. So that's how we've been able to frame that project. Dr. Wiley's in London at Western Ontario, and so she does a lot of on-the-ground work at that site, and then I do the same for Thunder Bay. And so then we have the localized context. If anyone's been to Thunder Bay particular, everyone kind of knows everyone. There's always some level of accountability. And then also even financially, right? So what else could we be using that money for that would have maybe paid for hotels and flights and different things like that? So thinking about the importance of place in your work too. Next slide. Yeah. And then just quickly to look at how is the research conducted on the ground. So here's just a couple examples when I was talking about how things might differ in terms of a spiritual context or paradigm. So knowledge holder I work with, Dorothy Taylor from Curve Lake First Nation, she talked to me a lot about this. She said, when I do talks, like it's not really me, it's spirit guiding me. So if you think about that in relation to interviews, how does that kind of change your practice? I know like for Anishinaabe paradigms, right, one of our teachings is understanding our dependence on the rest of creation. We have ceremonies and different things to acknowledge our limitations and a way to gain access to different spirits and beings who have a lot more knowledge than we do. So if we ask too many questions, for example, or ask questions, how does that interfere with spirit's ability to do work? Even in terms of research ethics applications. So some of these we see individually we might have power over. Some of them I think are just more conversations we need to be having to try to change things structurally. So these are just a couple examples, but research ethics applications, right? We have to put it's ethical to give people the right to withdraw. So recently I was doing work, I was interviewing an Indigenous knowledge holder around relationships with food and land. And so she started by saying how she did a pipe ceremony before coming to do the talk to get guidance, right? And so within our paradigm, that pipe is a teacher, right? That pipe is a knowledge holder. So it seemed really inappropriate and really just silly asking, if you said something that you shouldn't have said, you have a right to withdraw, right? Like it looked like I had no concept or idea of that pipe ceremony that just happened and that importance. So it didn't acknowledge all that planning and preparation and guidance from that pipe. So she was very clear and knew what she had wanted to say, right? It just totally kind of erased that whole process. So just, I think we need to have more conversations of if we're thinking about different paradigms, how appropriate, how is some of these requests actually ethical, or is that erasure actually unethical in that situation? Kim Anderson talks about that too. The idea of the universality of research ethics applications. So the fact if I'm doing work in my community, right, it's a group of people on a board who's never been to my community probably, telling me how to behave ethically. So she's advocating and talking about what would maybe a tiered or a different sort of process look like that's more localized to people's circumstances. Yeah, maybe I'll just leave that there. But so those are just some kind of on the ground and structural examples of, I think, how some of our research processes need to be adjusted to account and give space for work being conducted in spiritual paradigms. And so I promised we'd return to this story. So I just wanted to kind of open it up. So has anyone, had the story work on them and have any thoughts on what that story meant for them in terms of maybe their role as a researcher doing health research? Yeah.
To me, it spoke a lot about not making assumptions when you're going into things, not assuming you know something, or that you know the full picture, and also not being rash and taking your time and taking things as they're supposed to be coming to you, and not being I need this now.
Yeah. Yeah. So when Wanabojo talked to the cedar tree, it may have been a totally different outcome if he had just asked, is there anything else I need to know? Right? Maybe the tree would have said, well, you're on the edge of a cliff, so you're really close, but you want to follow that path down. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
This made me think of not holding our research questions as the be all and end all, because they might be missing something huge.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It closed off a lot of conversation and space for additional information to emerge. Next slide. So this is just here. These are just some questions that I had from the story. So one, I think it serves the purpose of even just disrupting what may be in our tool bag, or think about how we come to know knowledge, right, in the story. So if you think of the knowledge systems or ways of knowing that are privileged, right, the fact Wanabojo was able to become a snake, and then Wanabojo again. I never really explained the shape that Wanabojo was in to begin with either. What assumptions did Wanabojo make? How did they impact his relationships? We talked about this one, the interaction with the trees. So it was very much this power relation of researcher, researchee. How could Wanabojo have interacted differently? So we talked a bit about that. Why did Wanabojo get stuck and stay stuck? I think that was mentioned too. So there was really that focus, right, on okay, this is the anti-oppressive agenda, or within our context, but this is the agenda I'm working towards. But not spending as much time in terms of the own process to achieve that outcome. So it was, I'm going to get the meat, and then it was still, I'm going to get the meat, but I'm going to get the meat and I'm going to get to the river. And that was kind of what blinded Wanabojo. And what other options did Wanabojo have to get the meat? So why didn't Wanabojo choose those? So for me in this story, it's not an exact understanding of some of the processes that we may have to go through, but I sort of thought about the Wanabojo as being the researcher and the meat as being kind of that end goal or anti-oppressive agenda. and then different participants, right? Trees being some of the participants in the project along the way. Yeah, with that, just want to say miigwech, and do we have time for some questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much. So anyone have questions for Dr. Ray? Joan, please.
That was just lovely. I really enjoyed that very much. I mean, it raised so many issues for me. I am a retired medical sociologist in this faculty, and I was just thinking. I've been in constant search recently for how to understand the Indigenous matter in my head, because partway through my career, postmodernism came along, and at that time, that was a major kind of shake-up where we all sat around at a table like this and said, what? How do you think about this in relation to the kind of science and all the things that you had learned and everything, and struggled through it, and then it was the kind of beginning of an attempt, certainly for me, to really enjoy and to really try to embrace new forms of knowledge that come along and questioning assumptions. So this, for me, is the context in which I'm listening to you, because I'm so interested in trying to grasp what is noble to me as a non-Indigenous sociologist. And one of the things that caught my attention, that there are many points of resonance. That's why I enjoyed your talk so much. One of them was the parallel between the history of the sociology of medicine and this kind of invitation to enter this understanding, where it was originally the sociology in medicine, where you applied sociology in medicine, and of course it was all about the patient. You know, how do you handle patients and patient experience, and when they didn't do what the doctor said, and how do you get patients to do certain things, and what's the nature of patient suffering. So when you talk about the emphasis on always being on Indigenous suffering or the Indigenous peoples themselves, as opposed to on the other side as the nature, the sociology of non-white, the system, colonial society, and so on, that really resonated, because it's a direct parallel to the kind of positioning that sociologists like me took in the field, and the challenges of shifting perspective, because it really hasn't shifted very much, which is not a very encouraging thing. Because we still focus on the patients and patient experience, and particularly in the qualitative world, the emphasis is still so overwhelmingly on what's good for looking at patient experience, and that same impetus might be for qualitative researchers to, well, let's look at the Indigenous experience. You're drawn to that part of it more than to the other part of it, looking at ourselves and our societies and so on. So that was the first thing that really resonated. And the second thing that resonated, well, I don't know if resonate is the right word, that continues to intrigue me, is the distinction between spiritual and the social. As a sociologist, I always thought of the spiritual as part of the social. Maybe that's just the sociological, the dominance of a sociological perspective. Because I think of the spiritual as being socially produced. Now, I don't know, that's maybe just the arrogance of my discipline or something, but I haven't yet, I'm not able to kind of grab that bit yet. There's obviously a lot of work I need in my own head to be able to grab that part of what you told us. But thank you. Those are not questions. They're just observations on ways in which I could connect to what you were saying. So thank you very much.
And there is Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee scholar. I don't think she's too far from here, Vanessa Watts. She has a really great paper, and it's called Place Thought. And she really talks about that idea of what does it mean for the land to be alive and the agency of the land. And so that really gets at that and talks about the distinction between spirituality within a social space versus spirituality. And so, yeah, it goes back to well, there's lots of stories and teachings and different things. But again, that idea that, yeah, we have a lot of limitations in terms of what we could know. Whereas if you think of a sin, rocks, right? Like you might hear that terminology calling rocks Mishomis, grandfathers. So when rocks become activated, say in a ceremony, we're able to access the knowledge that they hold. So it's that spiritual ceremony that accesses that. And so if you think of a rock and how old a rock or a mountain is, or just other spiritual beings, yeah, they hold so much more knowledge than us. So even too, when we're talking about like postmodernism, so, and the idea of multiple realities. So because there is a lot of emphasis on the spiritual and the social, at least in Anishinaabe paradigms, there definitely is that space. But that at the same time, there's not limitless multiple realities, right? So we still have our natural laws that come to us from Gajemnado, which actually are more concrete, right? And that reality is one, in one respect, one reality. So yeah, I would recommend that article. I won't do it justice, just trying to kind of pick out some points and speak to it. But it's a really great article, and I use that one a lot in my own writing and in my own thinking. And in terms of your point around focusing on the patient, it's kind of like with the TRC, right? Like one of the critiques of the TRC is, hey, you've done all this work to document how oppressed Indigenous peoples are. So at the same time, you're documenting all this oppression, but at the same time now there's all these expectations for change. So even just thinking about it as a very logical level, who is in more of a position to be able to change and make change, right? A doctor or a patient, for example. So again, me and Dr. Loy, it hasn't been published yet, but we wrote a paper that looked at a case story of an Indigenous patient, and we applied complexity theory to it because I think that's really helpful, and I think there's parallels with Indigenous knowledge systems. So in that article, we looked at, right, it's all about in complexity adaptability and what are kind of maybe constraining circumstances that different complex adaptive systems put on each other. And so when we looked at this case, we actually saw how resilient or adaptive the Indigenous patient was. But there's just still always limitations, right? There's set limitations. There's not infinite mounds of adaptability always. And so where actually there was an ability to make change was in these other complex adaptive systems, like the healthcare system, like the doctor, for example. So yeah, that's kind of been a theoretical lens that we've used to try to explore that concept more of what happens when, we're not just centering on the source of who is oppressed, right? But who is actually in the position of power or doing the oppressing. They have often more resources and other factors which allow them to be more adaptable to support change. Yeah.
Any more questions? Please.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time. Vanessa's actually my older sister.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you can tell her. I haven't met her, but I love her stuff.
I'll be sure to tell her. So I'm coming at this not from the lens of health, but from education.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm currently a PhD student, and talking about the difference between strategic and convergence was really interesting for me, because I often find myself conflicted with do I step into this and want to approach my work from this radical a lens, being we need to really push the government, settlers, et cetera, for policy change, or do I engage in acts of resurgence, learning language, going to ceremony and being around people in that way. and I don't know, I might be caught in a binary here, but I often struggle with like whose job could it be, or whose role could it be to be doing this, like advocating and standing up to then allow Indigenous people to actually engage in resurgence, because it feels like there are all these roadblocks to be able to engage in resurgence, right? Like, let's have some drinking water in our community, and like continuing to need to fight for that. And so then we can't even think about beginning to engage in like reclaiming ceremony and reclaiming language. And so I just wondered your thoughts of like, maybe, I don't know, maybe you went through something similar to what I'm going through, like when you were a doctoral student, and just like how you navigated that and your thoughts around it.
Yeah, and I still have those thoughts, and I'm still navigating it. And actually maybe about a month or two, we had Pam Palmater. She came and did a talk at the law school, and she was having that same conversation. So for me, I was thinking, okay, I'm not the only one still struggling with this too. And I think like what she talked about is that idea of, I would love to be over here. Yeah, I would love to be, just living in this space of resurgence. But right, settler colonialism is still happening. Every day Indigenous peoples are trying to survive ethically, right? We can't ignore this. So I think there's a lot of space for non-Indigenous researchers and scholars to be doing some of that work. I just think it's important that it's approached from the right lens. So not from that helping lens, but yeah, what happens if we approach it from a lens of treaty responsibilities? So if you look at traditional wampum belts and agreements, right, they talk about the fact of Indigenous peoples being able to be self-determining and being able to live in a way where their way of life isn't impacted. So I hear that sometimes from non-Indigenous researchers or activists, or, well, I don't want to take up this space or be this voice. But I think there's a role to play when you approach it as your government, your system, is now not following your treaty obligations that were promised to not impose on another way of life. So how can you advocate so that your systems, your society, your structure, your government is able to change their way so they're not altering? So I think if it's approached that way, then there creates a lot of space for non-Indigenous peoples to pick up and do a lot of that work, and allow more time for Indigenous scholars to focus on the Indigenous resurgence work.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
You both put your hands up at the same time. So
I was just curious, since Vanessa Watts came up a couple times now, what was the title of the article that you were referring to?
You might know that. Do you know it better than me? Yeah.
It's place thought.
Place thought?
Place thought.
I really liked your questions and the direction of like whose role is it for doing what in moving this work forward. And I find as a non-Indigenous person doing research in this field, I have other non-Indigenous scholars come to me saying, oh yeah, I want to be part of your research project, we want to be involved. And they want to be involved with bringing Indigenous ways of knowing to the academy and to the university, and doing smudges for people in the hospital. And it seems like it's so misguided. They want to be allies, and yet they're just perpetuating the same kind of problems because they aren't wanting to take on the hard work of a non-Indigenous ally, calling out racism of your colleagues that you work with in the hospital or environment. So I find it really struggles where we have all sorts of people talking about they want to bring Indigenous knowledge to inform their way of doing their work, and I feel like it creates a space where reconciliation seems to be more about the white people feeling comfortable to engage in this work rather than some of the making space and challenging some of those systems that are perpetuating oppression. So how do you see the role of allies then in moving some of this work forward that's not sort of expropriating Indigenous ways of doing it?
Yeah, and I think maybe one of the most important things is a distinction between when engaging in Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, like what's the intent, why are you doing it, right? So Are you doing it because then you want to fill like a Aboriginal liaison cultural role in a hospital? Like, that's probably not the best place, right? So, I mean, I think it's important to have to engage with Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, because if critical approaches are going to work side by side together with Indigenous approaches, there needs to be that understanding of each side. So knowing it to then be able to inform the work you're doing from a critical approach is important. But if you're learning it to then say, you know, now I'm going to teach a course on Indigenous cultures, or I'm going to apply for a grant and be, talk about, things related to kind of that spiritual paradigm, and kind of start to become an authority on that. I think there's definitely ethical implications that again go back to that idea of understanding maybe how our power or privilege puts us in a position to come to know in the first place. So is it ethical for people in our own communities to not know their language, not have access, not know their cultures, but then have, experts emerging who are non-Indigenous researchers? So I think that understanding is important, so getting it, but understanding the context of why that's important, and then working alongside in terms of, from that lens of treaty responsibility, and how can I make sure my system, my government, isn't impeding on the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. So I think those are kind of summed up in a couple of lines, but if people could kind of keep that in their head, I think that would go a long way to kind of clarifying what often becomes really, really muddy, right, in terms of doing that work, and really difficult, and takes a lot of time and emotional labor to continue to have those conversations too. Yeah, I don't know, does that answer? Yeah. Okay.
I wonder, I'm just conscious of the time. I wonder if we could have one more question. Question or comment? Okay, thank you. Should we thank Dr. Ray for her wonderful time?